everyone, my name is Matt, Cryptic if you prefer, and today I wanted to talk about rendering and lighting inside of Maya. I seem to get this question a lot, is how I create the renders that I do, how I work with lighting inside Maya, and how I get my final results. So this entire video is going to go over step by step how I would approach lighting this. I'm going to go through some of the things that I did to get the result that I wanted and how you can do the same in your projects. Some of it requires a little bit of technical knowledge and others just artistic choice. But all in all, I want to show you guys how to kind of get your project from start to finish in as little time as possible. So we have our minigun scene here. I just finished up this project, and so what I've done is I've deleted everything lighting wise and rendering wise, and we're starting just with fresh. So we have just the minigun and nothing else. When approaching a project like this, what I wanted to do was to replicate sunlight. There are a couple of ways to do this. One of the fastest and kind of biggest shortcuts that you can do is using what's called an HDRI. So what we'll do is we'll load an HDRI into our scene. So you're going to go over to your Arnold tab. You're going to go up here to create a sky dome light. We're going to create that sky dome light, and that's going to give us our kind of our external light. And so right now, if we rendered the scene, we would have nothing. It would just be black. There's going to be no detail. You're not going to see your object at all. But once we add this, it's going to really kind of bring the scene together. So we're going to go ahead and change the color, go to File, and then if you want to download an HDRI from Polyhaven or any of the multitude of sites that allow you to download HDRIs or sell them, go ahead. I just have a select collection that I use that I've downloaded over time. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my HDRI folder, and then we're going to choose this Citrus Orchard Road. The reason I like this is because it has kind of a duller sky. It's a little bit more desert looking, and overall it just gives a really good kind of clean result. So you can see that it's super blown out in the viewport. Don't worry about that. That's really not going to affect anything. And then one thing I like to do is I'll go over to my layers. I'll select my light, and I'll just create a layer real quick. This just allows me to kind of turn on, turn off when I don't need it. So if we look at that now, we go ahead and go to render. We'll change to Arnold, and you'll see immediately the backdrop changes, but you'll also see what this does for our model. So this is tough, right? Because we have our light in the background. You can tell the colors are a little jacked up. Like it's just really kind of a mess. So what I normally will do is I'm going to go up here to settings, scroll all the way down to visibility, and turn off camera visibility. You can see that once it updates, that completely removes camera visibility. So you can already tell that that HDRI is giving us a really good result. It's nice. It's very clean. It's not super overblown. And we're also getting some color in some of the reflections. So this method is called IBL lighting, or image-based lighting. And it's a good way to get a ground start on what you're doing without throwing a bunch of lights into your scene and kind of trying to figure out what you're doing. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and turn off our renderer for now. And then I'm also gonna hide my light. So we have to think of this now as we need a sun, right? We don't have a sun. There are a couple of ways you can do this. So we'll go to our rendering tab. So one of the many ways people will do this is they'll create what's called a directional light. And we can see what happens here. In fact, let's do this. So what I want to do real quick is I want to kind of set myself up so I can replicate this and I can see the changes I'm making without too much change in my scene. So we're going to go ahead and create a camera, and you'll see that camera right here. So one trick I like to use, you can just go to Panels, Perspective, and change it to your camera. From here, we can go up here, just kind of adjust. And then we'll say, we'll turn on our film gate, and we'll just zoom in a little bit, just frame it up as best you can, or whatever you're working on really. And then we'll go right back to perspective. So this camera, we don't want to touch that. So we're gonna leave our camera there. We don't want to touch it. Just gonna be our viewpoint. So we'll open our render window, go to camera shape, and then hit render. This is gonna give us our first frame. And then go ahead and save that snapshot, because we're gonna start kind of working through this. The way I like to approach my rendering and my process from, you know, base model to final render is I like to go in steps. So each step I will add a new light, and I'll start working from there. So what do we want to do? We want some sort of like physical sun. So what you can do, you can use a directional light. This is one way to just kind of really quickly and easily just add in kind of a sunlight. So we'll pull this up. Usually I'll scale these a little bit just so I can see what I'm doing. And so we'll turn this. And so you can kind of manually adjust and just try to figure out where it's pointing, or you can hit T and it'll give you a separate kind of controller. That's going to adjust where the light's actually pointing. So we want the light pointing kind of at the top of this thing. And so we'll just call this our sun, basically. You're going to want to go over to your attribute editor. We're going to go down to our Arnold dropdown, and we're going to use color temperature. I set this to about 5900, which right around the color temperature of the sun. And then our exposure is what's going to be really important here. So we need to find an exposure that's going to work for us. So I'll usually start kind of in the middle, go about 10, and then we'll open up our render view again, and we'll hit render. So we can see immediately that was way too much. It's blown out, it's white. We've just added way too much power to that. So go ahead and save that snapshot down here. And we're going to dial that back. So let's go, I'm thinking about 2. So we'll do another render. It's much darker, but we're getting these highlights. So this is kind of what we want. So what we need to do is turn our IBL back on. So we're going to open that up, go back, save that snapshot, and we're going to go ahead and do one more render. Okay, so we have a really nice kind of clean render now. So we'll save that. So you can see how just with a little bit of adjustment, we've gone from overly blown out to a really dark render to adding that IBL and getting in that really nice clean lighting. And you can tell a huge stark contrast now between just the IBL light with the added sunlight. But looking at this, we have a couple issues. One, super dark in here. Yes, it technically is probably more realistic just because of the way the sun's going to work. However, in 3D, we want to draw attention to areas. We want areas to kind of show up. And so this area just isn't really looking right for me. So we need to figure out how we're going to get some light up into this area. So there's a couple ways we could do this. The first way is kind of understanding how light works. So we'll go into our polygon modeling and we're going to create a plane. We'll scale that up. And then we just need to assign a material to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign a new material. We're going to go shader, AI standard surface. And that's really all we're going to need. We'll go ahead and click render. We'll save that snapshot. So you can tell kind of what happened here. So if you look at the original render with just the sunlight, you can tell it's hitting that top part. But with the plane underneath it with the material added to it, we're getting that nice reflection. So the light is hitting that, bouncing up, and kind of underlighting it. So now if we go ahead and combine that with our IBL light, and we hit render again, now you can see we're getting a much cleaner render. So looking at this, if you take your render that we have now versus the one that was just the light and the IBL, you can see we're getting all of this bounce effect now. And a lot of this is reflectivity in the material as well, but there is light bounce that comes up and lights the bottom of this object. So we get this much more even, clean lighting. The issue here is now you have this big white plane in the way, and it's ugly. It doesn't match at all, and you don't want this in your scene. So we can click the plane, we can go to our attribute editor, we can go to Arnold, and we can turn off primary visibility. What this does is it makes it invisible to the scene in render, but still visible in reflections. So we hit that snapshot. So you can see there's no difference between these two renders, aside from the fact that our plane is gone. There are other ways to do this. There are other ways to accomplish this. And there's other ways that I've done this before. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete that. One of the ways that I like to do this is I will actually go into my rendering and I'll create an area light. With our area light created, what we can do is we can scale it out. And then I'm going to rotate it down. This is in turn going to do the same thing the plane is doing, except it's going to be passing actual light. So we'll scale that out a bit, drop it down because you don't want it pressed up against it. And then we're going to go to Arnold. We're going to set it up the same way as the other light. We're going to go to and enter. But the thing that we're going to change here is, say, I want this to be out in the desert. So I want this light hitting sand and reflecting up. So I want that kind of color. So we're going to add a little bit of a yellow tinge to it. Nothing too crazy, just a little bit. So with that set up, we're going to go ahead and go into here and we'll do a render. So we take that snapshot. You can see now, instead of this like bright, vibrant white, we have this kind of dull sand tone to it. A lot of this is because I didn't give that light enough power. So let's go ahead and give it some more power. So we'll bump it up to about 6. And we'll do a new render. So with that new render, we can select it. And we can see that there's really no change here. And this is where it gets kind of tricky because lights require a little bit more power than what we're giving it. So what we'll do is we'll take this and we're going to bump this up to about 12. Generally, the way Arnold handles Maya's built-in lights that aren't Arnold-based lights, you do have to kind of overpower them. So generally, when I'm configuring my lights in Maya, I'm going to use a power between 12 to 20. And that usually gets me where I want to be. So let's check this out and see what changed. So now you can see we're starting to get that nice highlight in there. So if we look at this render compared to this render, you can see that we're starting to get that light coming through. It's getting less dark. We're also getting that nice tan color coming through. So I'm going to take that light and I'm going to bump it up to about 16. So I'll usually just kind of go up in increments of 4 in order to get to where I want to go, just because it's a little bit faster. And then I'll dial back if I need to. So we can see that 16 was too much. Now it looks like it's being lit, and that's obviously not what we want. This is kind of something you would want if this were sitting on like a boat dock and the water was reflecting the light up. But this, you know, we're thinking about sand. We're not thinking about water here. So we're gonna find a nice spot in the middle. So probably about 13. We can see now if we compare that to the original, we've got that nice bounce light. It's not too much because you have to remember, bounce light is always going to lose its intensity. So if you have a bright light source coming down and hitting a plane and it's bouncing up, it's going to lose out on that intensity. So you're trying to replicate that concept where the light's coming down, it's hitting the sand, and it's bouncing up towards the actual object itself. We're also reflecting that color with that light. So this is the other way that I usually like to do it, just because I feel like it gives me more control than trying to fiddle with a material. So the last thing that we've got here that I'm not really a huge fan of is we've got this little spot. There's detail in here that I'd like to show off, but it's really not showing up. Plus the back handle's looking a little dull. We're not getting a whole lot. This is where a little bit of artistic control comes in. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna go in our scene. Go ahead and just hide this so you can see what I'm doing. So you can see we have our lights. So we've got our first light, our first light, our second light. We're gonna create one more light. So we're going to create a small point light. So we'll take our point light and we're going to move it kind of towards where I need it, right about up here. And then from here, we'll go into our attribute editor and Arnold, and then we're going to set the exposure to about 10. I don't want this to be super powerful right immediately. I just want to show some detail. So we're going to turn our dome light back on. I'm going to go up here and we're going to render. All right, so you can see what that did. We'll go ahead and save the snapshot. So here's our render, and then here's the difference. So you can see all that's doing is adding just a little bit more light to the scene, and it's showing off this interior portion here. So one other detail I like to add is what's called a rim light. This rim light is going to kind of add a backlighting to this object. So what we'll do is we'll turn off our dome light. We're going to create another area light, and we're going to move it over here. So go ahead and hit T. We're going to take this and just point it right here at the model. So we kind of want this sitting right there, and then I'm going to kind of put this back here. So my rim light, I want it to be just a pure white light. I want it to kind of just highlight some reflections. So we're going to go ahead and change the exposure up to 16 because it's a further away light, and this should give me a little bit of a highlight, and we'll hit render. So I left my IBL off for a reason here, because if I save the snapshot, you can tell what's changing here. So if we look at our original rendering, it's flat. There's really no like dimension to it. But if you look at the new one, we now have this nice white dimension to the outside of it. This is giving us that nice kind of like rim light, that sort of like edge lighting. So what we'll do now is we're actually going to turn on our light again, our IBL, and then I'm going to move this slightly because I want that light more towards the front. And then we'll hit render. Now you can see with that simple little trick, what we've done is we've created these kind of hot spots that show like that rim light. So they show kind of that dimension and that depth. And you get it all through this cable, up around here. There's just a little bit over here, but mostly we're getting it back here. So this is really cool because you can play with this and move it around your scene depending on how you're trying to backlight your object. Backlighting isn't always necessarily required, but it's really good to set up for display pieces like this because you're trying to show off the dimension of your object. This is generally how I will go about lighting my scene. I'll just kind of add a light, play with it, adjust it, get it to where I want it to be, and then call it good. So right here, this is basically the configuration I used for my final renders. So how do we get our final renders out of Maya? So we have all these images, but what do we do? So first off, if you look at this image, we're getting a lot of noise. There's a lot of just kind of problems that I want to clean up. So we're going to go ahead and open up our rendering settings. And from here, we're going to adjust a couple of things. So we are using Arnold. Right now, our samples are at default. So I'm going to boost camera to about 5. I'm going to boost diffuse to 1. I'm going to go to 3. Let's specular to 3, and transmission to 3. Generally, the way I follow this is if I'm boosting camera by 2, everything else underneath it gets boosted by 1. That's kind of the rule that I just generally follow because it usually gives me the best result that I don't have to worry too much about. This also changes if you're working in CPU versus GPU rendering. You'll notice if we change from CPU to GPU, if you have a GPU that supports it, we lose all those settings. We just get camera because it's calculating all the ray tracing and all that stuff itself. Super cool way to do it, super fast way to do it. But for this example, we're going to do CPU. So we've got these samples set up and we're going to minimize this. Go ahead and open up our render window again. So what's this going to do? This is going to increase the amount of rays that are coming from the camera, the diffuse, all of that. All of the rays that are bouncing around your scene are technically being doubled or increased by an increment of 1 to 2. So what we'll do now is we'll hit render, and this is going to take significantly longer, but the result's going to be cleaner. Okay, so we can see that our render now took significantly longer. It's up to about a minute. But when we save our snapshot, you'll see what changed. So you can see a lot of the kind of grunginess around the edges, and you may not be able to see this on the video, but you can see there's a change in there. So if I go and zoom in a little bit, you can see the change in the noise in the scene. So we've removed a lot of that noise and we have a much cleaner render. So these settings are settings that you want to play with in order to get a cleaner render out of Maya. They're going to go through and clean up the noise as well as some of the noise in the reflections. If we were dealing with objects that are made out of glass, those come in super important because that's how we clean up the interior reflections on that glass. With an object like this, it's a little bit different, a little bit simpler, but you can see the huge difference that made. It really cleaned up the render, not so much from like a distance standpoint, but up close, you can really tell like that made a huge difference. Those are the settings that I'll generally play with there. But you've got that set up now, you want to get your render kind of ready to go. You want to take care of it. So one of the last things that I'll do in the entire process, I'll go over to my comment tab, and then this is where you're going to set up kind of your render settings. So I try to render everything that I make in 4K. So what I'll do is I'll change this down here to whatever resolution I'm choosing. So 4K isn't available. There is a 4K square. I don't know why standard 4K is not in here, but we'll just do 3840 by 2160, and then we'll go to our render window again, and we will hit render. All right, so with that render done, we're up to like 5 minutes a frame now. So we've increased our render time, but what have we done? We've increased our detail. We've increased what the render is actually going to output. So if we zoom in here, you're gonna see how much cleaner this is. So we're gonna save this snapshot. So if you look at this, so this is the 1080p render, this is the 4K render. You're getting so much more detail, we're pulling so much more information out of there, and you don't lose out on the quality and the amount of work that you put into your textures. So this is super important because, and this is why I render in 4K, because it really does show the depth and detail. And you know, your platforms that you upload are gonna kind of downgrade the quality every once in a while, but sites like ArtStation, Kara, like they're going to allow you to have your art look the way it was rendered. So this is one reason why I'll do this way. And so we've got that. That's it. That's our render. We're done, right? How do we get it out of Maya? All you do, file, save image, and then put it on our desktop. We'll just do test underscore render underscore PNG or .png. This is important. Make sure you change the file type, otherwise Maya is just going to assign a default EXR to it. If you want a JPEG, if you want a PNG, a TIFF, whatever you're going to work with. EXRs are great because you have a lot more color data to work with, but that's a separate topic to cover. And then save. So now if we open that up, we have our minigun. And we have a really nice render of it. And you can zoom into it. You can see all the detail that you put in with your texture maps. And overall, it's just really cleanly lit. And you can see we've got our nice undertone lighting. We've got our nice sunlight coming down. Our environment lighting's kind of hitting everything. We have our rim light in the back. And that is how you go from just a regular flat 3D scene to a more well-lit representation of what you're actually trying to convey to the people viewing your art. Rendering and lighting can sometimes be an overcomplicated process. And so what I want to do is make sure that you guys feel like you can do this stuff without having to stress so much about it. One of the biggest things you can do to help yourself learn how to do this better is to gather your reference material, look at it, see how the sunlight is hitting things, see how shadows are forming on objects. Look at shadows in the environment. If you're modeling in an environment, look at how they're playing out. Are they dark shadows? Are they kind of light shadows? Are they stippled shadows from a tree? These are all things you have to look at and kind of identify with and figure out what look are you trying to get to, and just try to replicate it in the computer. Replicating it's the more difficult part, but with videos like this, I hope this helps you get a little bit further in being able to do this for yourself. With that said, thank you so much for watching. That's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please like it, subscribe, and follow me for more. I'll be doing more videos like this as we go on, including getting away from things like modeling and moving into things like animation and simulation. We're going to be doing all sorts of stuff on this channel, so please make sure you're following so you can be a part of that journey. Everybody, again, thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video.